John Manske with Ramsey County Public Works Department. I'm in the Lake Management Division. I manage a state certified laboratory for water quality sampling. And during the summer months, our main job is sampling water quality on the 30 lakes that Ramsey County has a vested interest in. Either we own property on it or in a partnership. We work with the watershed districts in the area on a number of projects, some carp removal and some aeration efforts. Some of our lakes had a history of winter kills that we've documented going back at our time in the county. And over the years, we partnered with the DNR to try and come up with the best, approach for aerating those systems. We use a number of different style systems depending on what type of land ownership we have. If we have the grade to actually do a pump and baffle, or if you have the electrical outlets, stuff like that. So we get into more of that later, but for the most part, I'm a limnologist and chemist in training, and just kind of got into the aeration game because I'm the guy with the boats and do the dissolved oxygen testing. We do a lot of dissolved oxygen testing with our systems when we're setting them up to try and see how effective they are, to kind of learn going forward, see what kind of range we're getting with them and stuff like that. So with that, I'll pass it off to Jessie.
Hi, I'm Jessie Koehle, and I work for the City of Eagan. So I have a background in fisheries biology and lake biology. And when I started working for Eagan, which is a suburb of Twin Cities, I assume everybody here is Twin Cities, we have more than our share of small inland lakes. And so the city has its own water resources division of public works. So I'm one of 4 staff, full-time staff there, but I'm sort of the lake and fish and bugs person. So I sort of inherited a winter aeration program. I think they'd started back in the 90s doing just a couple of lakes to prevent winter kill on neighborhood fishing lakes. And now I am in charge of 13 lakes that I aerate every winter if needed. I also do water quality sampling. We have 30, 35 water bodies. Some of them are as small as 7 acres. Some of them are 40 acres maybe, but the deepest ones are 30 feet maybe. And most of them are less than 10 feet deep. So many of these systems would winter kill if not for aeration. And so I do, in the wintertime, I go out and sample the dissolved oxygen of these places, and I don't install the aerators unless it drops below 5 parts per million. And we, at the moment that I know of, don't have carp problems, but it certainly does help to stabilize the fish community when you can maintain sort of a predator-prey stable balance versus having a system with partial winter kills and then you end up with all goldfish or bullheads or something. So we provide recreational fishing opportunities through this aeration program. We do stocking, I do fish surveys as well, sort of mirroring what the DNR folks would do, but just less of it. And we also are using aeration to sort of stabilize these trophic levels and make sure that if our water quality is good, that we can help preserve it in this way. So John and I have similar war stories, I think, just in different lakes. So we are happy to be here with you.
Nice, thanks, Jessie. So at the last meeting, we had some questions that came up about winter aerators and also from previous meetings as well. And so we summarized those questions and we gave them to John and Jessie before this. And so we're just going to go through these 6 questions. These are just common questions that come up. And then everyone is free to jump in and ask a question as we go. If you don't want to interrupt, I'll also be watching the chat and we'll bring up the questions before we move to the next one. So feel free to ask questions to John and Jessie either way. And with that, we will start off with our first question. So it's regarding feasibility. So under what circumstances would you both recommend or not recommend installing a winter aerator to prevent fish kill?
I think, John, you sort of answered first on these written questions. Do you want to take the same pattern?
I was actually going to bring that up, so I
Oh,
hit all
sure.
the points that I was hoping to hit on those. You had some good ones as well. Yeah, a lot of factors. I think when it comes down to it, one thing that I'll say right off the bat is when you start an aeration project, sometimes for whatever reason, you might have the funding today, but you might not have it in the future, and you might not have a partner in the future. And so partnerships and making sure you have the appropriate funding for these things are going for forever, basically, are important, because it becomes very unpopular to stop doing these activities once you start. You'll find your lake homeowners will be very upset with you, and you will probably find that even if you don't have the funding in your budget to keep doing this project, that maybe your elected officials might make you have that funding in your budget to keep doing this stuff. So that is a word of caution I would give everyone, is that make sure this is really warranted activity, and it can be very labor intensive during very not desirable times to be doing outdoor labor. And yeah, so that would be my main point. Another one would be, is your water body well suited for it? This can be best done probably by looking at a similar lake as far as depth, plant life, and sediment conditions. So that's what we've kind of done. Now that there's been a lot of this activity in the metro, a lot of us have good data on that can kind of be used to compare and contrast. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, those are good points. And, you know, since I say I sort of inherited our program, I have less of the struggle of, you know, looking for partners. We have quite a bit of like parkland around all these lakes that we will aerate. In the couple instances when we don't have easy electrical access from our parks, we have worked with individual homeowners, and we plug into their houses, and we reimburse them for the electricity that we use. But that certainly could change at any time. But like John says, folks associate aeration with good fishing, right? Because you're going to end up with, if you have game fish in your lakes, you're going to grow those for more seasons, and the hope is that you'll have big fish. So people really want these to keep going. I have people on lakes that I check regularly, and I know that the oxygen is still fine, and they're calling me worried. Why haven't you installed the aerator yet? I also have people who regularly would like to skate on the lake or drive their ATV or whatever it is. And once I install the aerator, that becomes extremely unsafe. So our lakes are small enough that if I install an aerator, it kind of messes up a good bit of the ice. Other lakes, you know, you guys might be dealing with other things. Like if it's a 200-acre lake and you've got your aerator in one little corner, maybe you don't have to worry about that. So knowing that there could be conflicts or contrasting demands, which will surprise no one, that's just good to think about in advance. I would say electrical access is what you're going to need. There's types of aerators that will run on solar power. The people who sell those will try to tell you that they will still run. I don't think that they're going to run in conditions where it's 30 below, which will happen at the least convenient time for you. So I would recommend always making sure if you're going to do this, you have electrical access, whether it's 120 or 220. I think 220 is ideal, but 120 is possible. And I would say, you know, the shallowest lake that we aerate is probably 5 or 6 feet deep at the place where the aerator is. Not that it doesn't get deeper, but that's where we have our access. And that has worked okay. But I don't think I would go any shallower than that. And then if you do have to run your cord out, say 100 feet onto the lake, you could do that. But keep in mind, someone has to carry that cord. And I have a hard time carrying any more than 100 feet of 10 gauge cord. I do have a place where I have 2 of those strung together, and I don't think it's ideal, but it works. I don't think I would go any farther than that, I guess, from your electrical point out, if that makes sense. I think that was those were my main points on that question.
Yeah, I would agree. 200 feet is the max we do. You have to use different gauges depending on your length, and you lose a certain amount of electricity. So your electrical bills will go up and your cord costs will go up the longer you run the cable. But you want to be in a deep enough spot that you're, you know, out into the lake. So I would agree 200 is the max we do. And I wouldn't recommend going any further than that.
We did get one special cord made that was 200 feet long. That thing is a booger to pull back in. It's really, it's good exercise, that's for sure, in the middle of winter. But we do get 10 gauge cord to minimize the drop in electricity at the motor's point. And yeah, we end up, I don't know, we don't have separate meters on all these things, but I think $300 to $400 a season is what we would pay minimum. We have pretty long cords.
As a kind of a follow-up on to some of the things you guys are saying, John, Jesse, the Minnehaha Creek is, me and Jill more so have been swirling and discussing where it seems like there's generally three approaches to putting out aeration, and there's reactionary. So you're measuring something where you go out. So Jesse, you kind of alluded to, you measure DO. There's planned where, hey, it's middle of January, we're just going to put it in. And then the third one, which I'm not aware exactly exists, but it might be the most beneficial, is there's some form of model that DO model, something like that, that could benefit group or these types of situations. And then I'll just add on to that, because I think one of the concerns you said is, John, that you brought up is concerns that down the road that funding could end. And if trying to think out ahead, if there's a model that you're using that says like this year or under this situation, this is really needed, do you feel like that in cases where funding might get cut or nipped, there could be greater, what I'll just call board appetite? I'm not sure who everybody responds to continue funding or fund in that situation, or maybe a second part is, why would funding get nipped on something that was kind of put in? Sorry, I know that's a very loaded multi-thought question, but it's something I know Jill and I are really swirling on, because for us, we've taken more of that, let's just plan it, let's just put them in. But in the back of our heads, we're kind of scratching and thinking like, do we really want to get ourselves into multiple lakes every single year from now to eternity, so to speak?
I'll take this one. What we do is each lake has its own model, basically, per se. Basically, it's you're looking at previous year's DO levels that I measure every 2 weeks or every month, depending on how quickly that lake traditionally loses oxygen. So our lakes that we don't necessarily aerate every year, I would do once a month. The lakes that we do every single year, the second there's safe ice, I go out there and I get a baseline. And then every 2 weeks we're measuring it. And what you'll find is it goes down pretty slow. And as soon as that plant community drops, because you've got snow on top of the ice, and starts breaking down, that DO just crashes. So you'll be safe literally a week before you're below 5. So we start ours that we know we're going to do every year as early as we have a thick enough ice, maybe like 4 or 5 inches to make our signs stay up. And then we're doing it as soon as we can. If you go too long, you get a foot of ice potentially after a cold snap. It becomes harder to cut your holes. The whole process can be a little more challenging. But basically, yeah, we're looking lake by lake at historic, through the ice, dissolved oxygen measurements that I'm taking at the site. We'll be doing aeration. And I think that's a really big, important part of this is the monitoring to make sure your system's effective. You go out in front of the aerators and check, how far of a refuge or how big of a refuge are we actually making? Do we need to up the number of aerators here? Do we need more horsepower, something like that? And also to tell you when to turn it on. So we could have them on all the way into May. So you don't want to necessarily start them up in November if we get early ice, if you don't warn them. Jesse waits till 5 milligrams per liter. We, like I said, start ours a little earlier, but also edging closer to 5 so that you're not doing those early months when it's not needed. Another thing, when we get first ice up and there's no snow on the ice, we almost always have super saturated oxygen conditions. And if we turn them on then, the air just bubbles straight back out at the motor and it like splashes onto the motor and can damage the motor. So you need to be checking them just to make sure you're not super saturated, because we had that this year for a month plus. And I had lots of people calling, hey, why don't you turn them on yet? Well, turn them on, I run the risk of damaging them, and I literally can't put any more oxygen into the water. So measuring while you're doing it on each lake is an important thing, in my opinion.
I think it's one thing when you say, okay, I'm planning, I see that the weather's going to be good on Wednesday and Thursday. I can get 3 systems in each of those days. I'm halfway done. So if I know that the ice is safe, and if I know that these lakes usually tend to need them, that is a good way to proactively plan. Certainly the ones that I don't have to put out, and like John says, I would measure those maybe every 2 weeks. Like I had one lake that I didn't have to install at all. And that means I also don't have to go back out and pick up the equipment. So for me, it's kind of a double win. It feels like a big commitment. I don't know how many lakes you're looking at, Tom, but I don't know. I think it's a good point. If you get good thick ice and you don't have any snow on top, probably that place is going to be just fine for a long time as far as oxygen goes. But as soon as you get 3 inches of snow on top, that's when the lights go off on the plants and everything's going to drop within a week or 2. So you don't want to get caught reactionary where everything needs to be installed that week. I did have, I don't go out and measure after I've installed the aerator. And part of that is just like, I don't have time. I don't want to make time. I don't trust the ice, and part of that is like, that's the most that I can do for these fish. So if this doesn't work, I don't have other tools. Like I don't have a whole bunch of extra aerators. I have what I need, but I don't have a ton of extra ones. So if that doesn't work, nothing's going to work for me. But I also, during the years, even when it gets really cold, as long as the aerator doesn't break, we haven't seen fish kill. So whatever's happening there, it's enough to keep them alive, especially if you're talking about bluegill for carp eggs. You're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? You had 3 categories.
Yeah, no, it totally does. It's, I think for us, we're kind of contemplating, our objective isn't, the premise of why we started aerating is the theory that aeration is needed to keep bluegills alive to suppress carp recruitment. So some of our systems aren't necessarily like these high recreation lakes, stocking or doing other things. So it is we're having discussions of what would a model look like? How would we go about doing this to try to possibly figure out like, not only what are the years that are going to winter kill, but what are the years that it's a winter kill that carp get back in on top of they spawn, it's a complex web, but trying to tease out more or less like what are the feasible components to provide some more certainty around this, because I think some of the things you guys are addressing where land ownership, access, funding down the road, all of those are very legitimate concerns that we're not necessarily facing now, but I can perceive a question coming from a manager or board member down the road of, wait, like, why are we having troubles with this aeration? Why are we doing it? So it's all that forecasting out of trying to perceive what some options might be. So you guys, perfect answers. Thank you.
This is Brian from Three Rivers Park District, and I like your recommendation based on installing aerators after monitoring indicates dissolved oxygen levels around 5 milligrams per liter or 4. That's what we do here at the Park District. If the dissolved oxygen from our experience can crash very quickly once it gets to that point. We've had a couple situations where it was at 4 and literally the next week or 2 weeks we went out, it was 0. And now you're scrambling trying to get aerators out. So we've been more proactive that way by monitoring every 2 weeks ourselves. And when it hits 5, we're installing them, given the situation. So I think that's a good recommendation to kind of go off of.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I monitor because I have, maybe fewer in a closer area, so I can get all my monitoring done in one day and then sort of make my plan of attack for the next week or so. And so places that I monitor every week, they can go down 2 parts per million a week easily. And keep in mind, this is daytime, right? So the fish are going to be facing lower oxygen levels during the nighttime. And, they're pretty inactive during the winter. This doesn't seem to be a problem, but what you're seeing during the day is probably best case scenario. So I think, again, yeah, it makes sense to put it in when it's around 5. I've gotten away with it when I go out and I think it's going to be fine and it's at 2. I think, oh my God, then I go install the aerator the next day and I haven't had a winter kill. But I wouldn't, I think it makes sense. It's no fun to scramble, especially in winter.
Yeah, especially when you're depending on other staff to coordinate that to happen. And sometimes they can't drop everything they're doing at the time. So,
Yeah.
All right, well, go on to our next question. So aerator options. Based on your experience, which types or brands of winter aerators work best and why? And are some easier to install than others?
I'll let Jess go first on this one.
Okay, well, I think in general, from what I know, there are 3 basic types of aerators. There is one called a pump and baffle, which is, I don't have any of those anymore, but John does. It's sort of a permanent installation on a lake shore where water would be drawn in and then trickled down a ladder. And trickle, maybe, it's probably quite a flow, but it's a nice way where you can keep water running, and that will provide the oxygen that the fish need. And it's sort of a lower impact in some way because it's just right in one spot along shore, I'm guessing. Another kind is the one that we are mainly talking about, which is the floating electrical powered motor. So you've got the cord coming from some shore electrical outlet access, and it goes underwater a little bit, but at least if the ends stay dry, you're okay. You plug it into this motor that tends to have a bubbler and a propeller, and that floats on some kind of plastic float. And so that will create open water, which will help with surface mixing. It will help with the oxygen being bubbled in from the air. And it does open up quite a bit of water. It changes based on how cold it is. Sometimes at 30 below, it looks like there's no open water, but the thing is still bubbling. Sometimes at 40 degrees, you've got 500 feet of open water. So you do have to be careful where you put your signs. And then the third kind is you have a shore-based air compressor with an underwater like air hose, and it goes down to a diffuser, sort of like you might see in a fish tank, only way bigger. And that bubbles water up to, just vertically. So that opening would be much smaller. But from what I've read, you need a deep enough lake where it gives enough length of diffusion so that the oxygen can do a good job getting back into the water. We don't have any of these kind, but Apple Valley does, and I'm jealous because they always say, we just flip a switch. They don't, you have to put out your thin ice sign still, but it's a fairly small area. They maybe pop a couple holes over where they know the diffuser will be to help open it up. And it's less of the drilling and heavy equipment and cords that we have to deal with. I would think that the diffusers get clogged, so I don't know how they fix that. Plus the compressor would have to run all the time, all winter, and that would be loud. So you'd have to have a permanent installation there, some kind of like shed or muffling thing that you'd have to worry about. So that's the rough overview. We use the floating systems, and the brand that we have mainly used is AERATOR, AIREO2. That's the kind that the DNR uses. We have also used American aerators in the past. The motors are really good, but the parts can be hard to come by, and they are heavier. So we've just switched over to the AERATORs. Did I miss anything, John?
No, I don't think so. I'll talk about some of those 3 systems. I have all 3 systems, actually. I used to have a compressor air tube diffuser system on Como Lake. Those diffusers do get clogged, and when they get clogged, they just shoot off. And you have to have a diver go down and put them on because my place won't let me do the diving, and we have some very high level of insurance needed for our divers, even to the point where I can usually only find like 1 diver in the whole state who will do it. So that became, from a maintenance standpoint, a no-go. The compressor is very expensive to maintain, probably $1,000 a year to have the oil changed and maintained. The diffuser parts themselves are cheap. Diver, again, really expensive. You have to do that diffuser replacement every 3 or 4 years. So we're talking from a maintenance standpoint, they're the most expensive and the most intensive, but you can just flip that switch. But you have to tweak the system all the time because, well, you just do. So when ours broke, I switched over to the floating aerator system. And we had, like, at the time, was the best diffuser compressor setup that we could come up with for Como Lake, which is 5 meters deep, maybe 15 feet. And we get better dissolved oxygen, spread concentration with 2 floating units. And that costs about 10% of the electrical cost as well, and almost no maintenance cost. I can do the maintenance myself, all that. So even if, I would say, unless you're doing a large scale one where you're trying to do whole lake aeration to reduce phosphorus loading, which I've seen some people do successful, that's the only time I would recommend a system like that, the air compressor diffuser, just because of the maintenance drama. The pump and baffle system, again, flip the switch, super easy, but the motors are much more expensive in the front end and much more expensive to maintain. But you usually get like 30 years out of those setups, assuming everything goes well, you don't have a freak breakdown. You love those because, yeah, you just flip the switch, and if something breaks, you have a tech come out and fix it, kind of thing. And for those, we really like Flight brand pumps. They're about twice as expensive as the same company's like cheaper brand. So a lot of times when we put out quotes for bid, people would say or equivalent, and then they would sell us, they would win the bid by giving us the very inferior product pump. And I will recommend you definitely say in your contract, no equivalent. It needs to be Flight brand, walking commercial for that company, because their pumps are just, they just don't break. I mean, those are the ones that are going to give you 30 years. We've had total dead 2-year-old pumps before at that cheaper price point. So definitely worth the extra money to go with that.
And that's a good point. If you go with the surface aerators from Aero 2, they come standard with ball door motors, but you can ask, it's like an extra, it's less than $100 for an upgrade to the Leeson motors. And you definitely want to go with Leeson because they are made better. They have thicker wire or something. I don't know.
They don't get their back end compromised. So the rear end of it sits up out of the water. And when you get snow and rain and all that stuff building up on it, in fact, it'll even make its own frost when you get dew point issues and stuff. That just leaks right in there. And then that motor explodes from getting water in it. And that's the only thing that'll kill that motor, basically. All the bearings, all the other things, you can fix them really cheap. But you get water in that back end, that's a problem. And our mechanic, Elroy's, shout out to Elroy's Electric in Inver Grove Heights, take all your motors there for them to get them fixed, because they are very good at this, from fixing me and Jessie's over the years. And he'll actually
Very economical. Yeah.
Very economical. They'll do a treatment on the rear end of that motor where they can bake on a laminate to prevent water, if it does getting in there, from compromising that unit. Highly recommend that. Get them maintained by them doing them every 2 years now, just because it's so challenging to go out in January in a boat, pull that motor when it breaks down, and take it to him for a couple days. And sometimes they get it done in a day, but then your hole might freeze up, and then you have a whole nother reinstall on your hands instead of, I don't know, which is the same reason why I always run 2 floating units to protect the other one when it breaks down. We're inspecting our floating units twice a week because of that ability to freeze up or just trip a breaker. If you get anything in it, it'll trip your breaker. It's not damaged, but it needs to be reset. And if you don't do it in a timely fashion, and it's cold, you're going to freeze up, and then you either got to leave it or cut it out or put another one behind it or do something to get that out of the ice.
Yeah, it's challenging when this motor froze in a couple days ago. You need to get it back on, because otherwise you're going to lose your fish population. But the ice, it's super cold, but this ice is only 2 inches thick. So it's a nightmare trying to get those things out. It's much better to keep on top of the maintenance and just make sure that you have good stuff going in. And yeah, I had another thought, but it's gone. I'm sure it'll come back. It was about maintenance or something.
Great. All right. Our next question is costs and funding. What is the average installation cost and maintenance cost of winter aeration system? We're thinking the floating ones, which is what you're recommending. And just the side question of, have you ever received grants for any of these?
I'll go. We don't get grants per se, but if the DNR is interested in the lake because they stock fish in it, they're willing to do a joint powers agreement with us and pay for equipment sometimes. I will note that their official stance on winter aeration is shifting because of funding and because we're just seeing less winter kills on our normal fishing stocking lakes, that they're opposed to it almost. So the DNR funding, I'm led to believe, is not going to be a thing forever going forward, and we've already seen it be more limited than it used to be.
I wonder if that might be, I mean, the guys at East Metro certainly tease me about how many lakes that I aerate, and they say, why don't you just let some of these partially winter kill? Come on, you know, the fishing might be better. I say, well, that is true. I am keeping alive all the teeny little bluegills. Well, but I hate to lose, you know, we've invested so much effort into these that for now, we're just going to keep doing it. But if you were to come to them and say, we have this carp problem, we need to keep our bluegill alive, that might be a sort of a different arena. I agree with John, is that their stance is shifting. But if it was for carp, you might have better success. And there might be stuff out there for carp control that John and I don't really experience, because if we're managing these lakes for fishing and, you know, game fish opportunities and winter kill prevention, you know, it might be different. If you say the word carp, there tends to be more money available. So yeah, maybe, I mean, I'm imagining, maybe some of you are laughing, but I think, you know, it's probably $2,000 for the system. If you're going to buy an Aero 2 motor and float, I don't think that includes the cord, because that's something we have purchased separately. You sort of have to figure out based on your needs for your site, how long your cord should be. And for us, that's been like $600, because we pay an electrician to put the ends on correctly, you know, and you get nice water resistant ends on these cords. And the 10 gauge cord for, you know, however long it needs to be is pretty expensive. So you might say $3,000 total for that. Plus you need a bunch of thin ice signs. DNR requires that you put out thin ice signs no more than 100 feet apart. And they have to be in some kind of rectangular or L-shaped or, you know, some kind of square pattern. So it makes sense to people who might come up upon it. So the signs are a bit of an investment too. Not that bad. And then the electricity for us, it could be as much as $300 a month, but that could be because we're running pretty long lines. If we run them, you know, for 2 or 3 months, 3 months is a long time to run them consistently. I find that I run them like January, February, and half of March is pretty average for us. So you might pay $600 or $300 per season per aerator. It sort of depends. What else did I miss? I think that's about it. You know, you need other little odds and ends. You're going to need a drill, like an ice auger, if you don't have something like that already. But if you're already testing your oxygen, you might have something. We bought a little 4.5-inch ice auger that you can put into a power drill. And that's a nice size for putting a hole in the ice and sticking in a 2x4 with a sign on it. And that's also a nice thing that you can use for oxygen testing. We tend to pop a hole like a postage stamp almost when we're cutting our aeration hole. And then I bought these awesome ice saws that I sent Maggie a link to that we just cut through. So, you know, and there's random tools like that that you might need if you don't already have that stuff.
For us, the biggest cost is getting electrical right up to the shoreline, dredging that electrical line, and then putting in a circuit breaker and box. Some of our boxes have to be secure, where we actually secure that end of the cord in the Metro, because people steal the cord because it has copper in it. So we've got our plugs in a box that when you close it, it seals it in there so it can't be pulled out. Yeah, I would say that's your biggest cost, and can run up to $10,000 to even dredge electrical a very short distance.
That's a very good point. And we had already kind of had that stuff, or like I said, we plugged into a couple people's houses. So, you know, and then insurance. We've had homeowner groups who are interested in putting in other aerators that the city isn't really interested in doing. And you have to be self-insured or have a policy up to, I forget what, for the DNR's requirements to get a permit, right? And then a permit itself to do aeration is currently $250 a year. But for my systems, those are waived because we have a joint interest in fishing and water quality. So
I think it's if you're a nonprofit as well. You don't have to have insurance coverage if you're a nonprofit.
oh, that's good.
Yeah.
But, foreseeing somebody falls through the ice and God forbid anybody, has a terrible accident or something, like you would need insurance for stuff like that. There's been, I shocked myself once because the thing wasn't grounded correctly and I'm fine, but that could have been an insurance situation. There's plenty of things that can go wrong with electricity and ice and water.
The permit is supposed to make you not liable, but I would agree, yes, you can always be sued. So just because the DNR permit says you're not liable because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean if somebody falls in and you're not 100% compliant that you wouldn't be able to be sued. So even if you were compliant, you could probably still be sued. So.
Well, in the city, we're government, but we just say we're self-insured. Like we have the League of Minnesota Cities insurance stuff, and that's enough to cover it. But let's say that 20 different homeowners wanted to get together and do this. Like one of them, wherever it was plugged in, probably would need to have some kind of insurance situation. So those are things that aren't immediately obvious when you're talking about equipment and planning for this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. So the next question is on maintenance. What are some of the maintenance considerations that we should be thinking about before installing a system? You kind of covered some of this already, but anything else?
We didn't talk about muskrats chewing through the cords. So nothing makes you want to purchase a pellet gun more than finding a muskrat chew halfway through a 100-foot cord that was new the previous year. So I don't know if the muskrats chew through them when they are plugged in and then they stop when they get to that electrical line, but it seems to me they chew right to the insulation and then they stop. But once I've turned them off, I do try to get them out fairly quickly because I've noticed more damage will happen from muskrat chewing at that time. And then of course the propeller is spinning, right? So fishing line can get entangled. Sometimes it's enough resistance to make it stop. And then you have to go get it, unwind it. Once in a while, like you can't turn these systems on and then off and then on again. Because if you turn them off and they freeze, right, there's water inside the propeller shaft. And if you try and turn that back on, our American aerators had a rubber coupler in there that would shred if the motor started to turn and the propeller couldn't turn because of ice. So sometimes one will go off and some helpful person will say, oh, I plugged it back in for you. And I say, God, why did you do that? Now I have to go get the motor and get it repaired. I think the most, for us, we've had trouble. We used to be eking along with our old pontoons and not really proactively replacing them. And then a pontoon would start to get water in it and it would sort of tip halfway. The motor would get wet. Then you have to get the whole thing fixed. That's kind of a nightmare. So if you go in with good equipment and you don't think you're terribly close to places where people would be casting out toward the open water and get their fishing line entangled, those are some things that would save you a little bit of time. I have muskrats chew through the anchor ropes that I use because you would want anchors or cement blocks or something, or poles. You could drill these things into the mud with vertical poles, but that might be hard too. I just have lots of wildlife interference with things like that. So you want to have backups of everything.
Backups of everything. I have backup motors on the shelf ready to go. I buy a 1,000-foot spool of cable and keep that ready to go because when you lose it, you need it like that day. I said in my responses that you either need an electrician on staff or you need to become an electrician and fully understand the electrical diagram of your system so that when it goes off, because you got ants in your circuit breaker or mouse urine in your box, which these are two real things that have happened all the time. You know how and why that happened and where it is, and you can pick it out yourself because you got to start paying an electrician every time you do that. Or, I do my own putting the plugs together on the cords because I can't. The funding's just not there to do that stuff. So if you're trying to minimize those sort of things, you really got to be get pretty savvy with that, unfortunately. Definitely not an electrician coming into this job, and definitely am one now.
That's good to know.
Yeah, if you put the plug on and you mix up the colors of the cord ends, it spins the opposite way and water comes back at you. That's a
I know
no-no.
right away.
All right, next question is common problems. You guys kind of covered some of these as well, but what are the common problems with winter aerators that we should know about?
What didn't we talk about yet?
I would say plants. For my pump and baffle systems, your inlet pipe or your intake pipe, there's a hot debate on whether or not you should have a graded cover on that. So the cover would prevent like a turtle from getting sucked up per se. But it would also catch all of the plant matter that is drawn to that inlet pipe. And, you know, we've taken them off on some systems and then had pump damage because of the large object that got sucked in. But if it doesn't, then you run the risk of your pump running dry because it can't get water. That's the thing. As far as the floating aerators go, they make a basket attachment, Aero2 does, that you can put on over the propeller that acts as a shield from the plants getting in there. But even with that, on Otter Lake, a very densely vegetated lake that I have, we get stuff in there all the time and it trips and I got to go out in the boat and pull it out. And that happens semi-regularly. And one thing I do to kind of combat that is you can either herbicide treat the exact location you're going to do earlier in the year. We put riprap rock down in the area to kind of prevent scouring, but also to give us protection from the plants coming up in that exact area. Or I've gone out and just manually raked the area around an inlet pipe in the fall right beforehand. Anything you can do to save you having to do it in the winter, because you don't want to go out there and clean out that inlet pipe in January, do it in September. Those would be my recommendations for plant areas with lots of plants.
I think the only thing that I haven't mentioned already is that sometimes I will get a lot of snow and ice buildup on my motors as well. So I don't know, sometimes the heat of the motor running or the black color of the plastic is enough. But if you get one of those days where you get a foot of snow dumped, you can see it sort of settling on. So I tend to go out, I scoot out in my canoe and just like tap on it and the stuff will come off. You don't want to puncture your float. You want to be really careful when you're knocking the ice off. But that's something that I've done proactively and I think it's helped us in some cases.
Great. So our last question, have you measured any water quality improvements or fish survival statistics before and after aerator install?
I think John has probably measured more than I have. I think just for us, the lack of dead fish in the spring tells us that it worked because you can compare it with other water bodies nearby. This winter, we had decent fish kills in non-aerated lakes and you'll know. It's pretty, I mean, if someone is out there anywhere near this lake, you'll be able to see dead fish floating if it didn't work.
Yeah, fish surveys are the best way. If the DNR is performing fish surveys out there, that's our big indicator. Some of our lakes where we've never seen any recruitment or walleyes live past the first year after aeration, we're seeing, trophy walleyes in the surveys. And that's the real, what you're really looking for. And that's really what sells people on it. So if you're not doing, or if the DNR doesn't do surveys and you want to get people to contribute and it's for fishing reasons or carp reasons or whatever, I would say, doing a fish survey with the DNR's protocol is really valuable to do pre and post as far as a selling point for, is this working? Is this worth the bang for the buck?
Yeah, and if you just wanted to do that once or twice or once every 10 years or something, you could hire it out. If you don't have the gear yourself, there's consultants.
Yeah, Bar's done it for some of our watershed districts in the area.
Yep, I know.
Not challenging. The equipment is just specialized and kind of expensive, but the DNR has been really good at, for us, giving us the exact locations they did there so we can make on their previous surveys, if they've done one on the lake, to make sure we can like duplicate that as closely as possible, which I think is really important. But yeah.
I think it's possible that when you open up this much ice, that the algae in the curly leaf pondweed might get a bit more of a head start, but I haven't measured that quantitatively. So it's a theory, but it's possible that my lakes would have grown that much algae anyway. So it's hard to know.
Yeah, you can definitely see it. We get like algae bloom sometimes even because you're getting that sediment stirring. Those pump and baffle systems are moving, I don't know, 1,500 gallons a minute. And one thing I will note is that you get 100% dissolved oxygen at the base of the style system that even if you have zero coming into the pipe, it's 100% saturated at the bottom, but you're getting that mixing. So that highly oxygenated water with newly suspended phosphorus is like, sometimes you get algae blooms. So that's why I said in the answers, you should definitely assess that when you're first doing this. So especially if it's a new design or a new style, I think it's really important to assess what are we impacting total suspended phosphorus in the area. You can do that by testing right at the outlet site and a far away site. And then what kind of dispersal or efficiency are we getting of dissolved oxygen?
Great. Well, do we have any other questions for John or Jessie? Their information is up here if you want to contact them afterwards, but any kind of lingering questions you still have for them? Nope, I think oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, one more random thought. So again, this goes back to me trying to dive into winter modeling and stuff. And the most closely related to aeration is climate related, where climate's warming, ice is going out sooner. So in some ways, aeration mimics that, but not, I mean, obviously we're talking completely different time scales. But the one question I do have is some of these papers alluded to the idea that earlier ice off could lead to increased summer algae or just warmer waters. And from a fishery standpoint, I guess I'll just boil it to the possibility of summer fish kills. Have you guys observed anything in your systems where you might not be getting that spring or that winter kill, but you've all of a sudden maybe traded it for a summer kill? And I know, again, not trying to say aeration is bad, but just the one devil's advocate thought I had when I came across stuff in model papers.
I mean, we haven't seen summer fish kills, and I have seen occasions when plants, like the plant community is so thick that right at the surface, it's like saturated, and then within half a meter down, it's zero, right? So we have had plants that are that thick. I think the difference, and part of this is coming from fish toxicology experiments at grad school, right? Like when fish become stressed from oxygen, they change their behavior. And one of those behaviors is that they will go up and like surface respirate if they need to, or they can try and find other refuges where like maybe pipes coming in or things like that. I think they're able to find those. Whereas in winter, it's just completely locked off because of the ice and they can't get to the surface anymore. I think it's possible aerators would influence plant communities, but I personally haven't seen any summer kills because of it. I don't know about John.
Yeah, I haven't seen it on lakes that we aerate. I would say Lake Johanna has this phenomenon where early spring filamentous algae matting is really bad. And it can actually drastically shift the pH of the water column if you get early ice out, where we have a long period where the water doesn't heat up enough for the other plants to take off. This lake is generally fairly clear and it just gets really dense on the bottom. And then the early spring fish that we see aren't from the winter, and the oxygen levels are fine all winter. And it's more of a probably pH stress kill as opposed to oxygen or anything else like that. So I have seen that on Lake Johanna periodically where we get calls where it's not a large amount of fish, but it's enough to warrant us going out there and picking them up and stuff. But not on a lake that we aerate though. If we saw that, that would be something you want to be assessing for, right? If you're getting a massive bloom that's quantifiably like dangerously high, you probably think about what you're doing there, shift your style of system there so you're minimizing resuspension as much as possible and anything else you can to prevent it.
The time that I saw a spring kill was when I didn't aerate. It was about maybe 4 parts per million. And I was like, oh, for crying out loud, it's the end of March, it's going to melt in a week. So I didn't aerate and they survived. But then about a week after ice out, the fish started dying because of a fungal infection. They were just stressed. So lesson learned, I guess. it wasn't a complete kill, but it was enough to have people call and report it.
Okay, great. Thanks for the observation notes.
Great. Any other questions for John or Jessie? All right. Well, thank you, John and Jessie, for coming and being on our expert panel for winter aerators. This was really good, helpful information. Given all of our recent fish kills in our ponds this year, I think a lot of people are considering it for next year. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, our pleasure.